A black pilot is attacked mid-flight by a police officer, just as they are facing a dangerous storm. But in a matter of minutes, that action leads the officer to a lifetime of regret. Will this flight change both their fates forever? Comment below to let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories of transformation and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more inspiring tales. Daniel Brooks sat on the edge of his bed, gazing dreamily out the window of his small apartment. The sky over Los Angeles was still dark, with only a few dim streetlights reflecting off the tall buildings. The clock on his phone reminded him it was time to prepare for another workday. Daniel stretched his shoulders, feeling the lingering ache from previous long flights. As a black pilot, Daniel didn't just face the pressures of the job, but also the familiar skeptical looks that had followed him throughout his career. Daniel grew up in a poor neighborhood where his dream of becoming a pilot was once seen as unrealistic. But that never stopped him. He overcame numerous challenges: education, exams, and the deep racial biases in an industry dominated by white men. Yet he had triumphed, becoming one of the airline's most talented and respected pilots. But today, something inside Daniel felt different. Maybe it was the small sense of unease he felt looking at the weather forecast for a looming storm in the Midwest, or perhaps it was just the fatigue from long, uninterrupted days of flying. Daniel stood up and quickly put on his crisp pilot's uniform. He pinned the silver pilot's badge to his chest and glanced at the mirror. It was a symbol of his relentless effort, all the perseverance it took to rise above every obstacle. He smiled proudly, though a trace of tiredness remained in his eyes. He quickly glanced at the family photo sitting neatly on the table, a picture of him in his pilot uniform, standing between his parents, both beaming with pride on his graduation day. Since childhood, his father, a former Navy pilot, had inspired Daniel to love the sky, while his mother had taught him never to give up, no matter the obstacles. Today, Daniel was piloting a routine flight from Los Angeles to New York, but the feeling of unease lingered. It could be the concern over the weather, but Daniel reassured himself that no matter how big the storm, it was just another part of the job he had prepared for thoroughly. While Daniel was on his way to the airport, John Caldwell, a middle-aged white police officer, was packing his bags for the upcoming flight. John had been a cop for 20 years and carried with him many haunting personal experiences. Over the years, he had seen and endured much, but losing a close friend during a riot involving black people had deeply entrenched a bias in him. This event left John always keeping an invisible distance from black people, viewing them as potentially dangerous. John had been on a long business trip in Los Angeles, and now he just wanted to return home to his normal life in New York. Arriving at the airport, he felt relieved that the flight would soon take him back to his family. But not long after, when he saw Daniel in his pilot's uniform, John felt an odd tension inside. He didn't know why, but Daniel's presence, a black pilot, made him uneasy. The unconscious fear and bias from past experiences quickly surfaced, making John eye Daniel with suspicion and discomfort. John sat silently, his eyes never leaving Daniel, and the unease inside him grew stronger as Daniel walked past the first-class seats into the cockpit. Negative thoughts began to cloud John's mind. Is he qualified? Am I safe on this flight? These questions swirled in his head, even though there was no real reason for his fear. It was merely the prejudice John had carried with him throughout his years as a police officer. As Daniel walked by, John muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Unbelievable, a black pilot." A few nearby passengers glanced at John, but no one said anything. Daniel heard it too, but he didn't react, continuing his professional stride. This wasn't the first time he had faced such comments. He had learned to ignore them, though they always left a painful mark. Daniel entered the cockpit, where his colleague, Eric Williams, was already waiting. Eric was a tall, calm white pilot, always ready to support Daniel, no matter the situation. The two had flown together on many flights before, building a strong working relationship based on mutual respect and trust. Eric glanced at Daniel as he entered. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing the tension in Daniel's eyes. Daniel nodded slightly, offering a faint smile. "Same as always," he said. But deep down, he knew John's comment had left a mark. He had grown accustomed to proving himself time and time again, but the weariness was inevitable. Eric placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, as if to encourage him. You're the best. Don't let those words get to you. Daniel nodded, regaining his confidence and focusing on the task ahead. He opened the control panel and began the pre-flight checks. Outside, passengers were still settling into their seats, while Daniel and Eric began discussing the weather. The storm in the Midwest had been forecasted, and they needed to adjust the flight path to avoid potential severe turbulence. Meanwhile, John sat in first class, fidgeting anxiously. Though he didn't say it, his unease grew. Memories of chaos and loss from his time as a police officer made him distrustful of others, especially black people. The looming storm only amplified the subconscious fear in his heart. A flight attendant walked by, bringing John the glass of water he requested. John looked at her, barely masking his discomfort. "Who's this pilot?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Is he experienced enough? I've never seen someone like him in the cockpit." The flight attendant, surprised by his question, maintained a professional demeanor and smiled politely. "Sir, Captain Brooks is one of the best. You can rest assured this flight is in good hands." John scoffed but said nothing further. Inside, his doubt remained undiminished. He turned back to look out the window, unable to stop the negative thoughts that kept spinning in his head. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Daniel and Eric completed their final pre-flight checks. The cockpit was quiet, except for the soft clicking of buttons and the hum of the airplane's systems. Though outwardly calm, Daniel still felt the weight of the skeptical looks he had encountered all morning, particularly from John. Eric, sensing his friend's quiet tension, leaned toward Daniel. "Don't let it bother you," Eric said softly, his gaze sincere. "Today is just another day, like the hundreds we've flown together before." Daniel smiled lightly. "I know," he replied, though the unease still lingered in his heart. "It's just that sometimes it's not as easy to brush off as you think." Eric nodded. He understood better than anyone what Daniel had to endure. As a close friend and longtime colleague, Eric had witnessed many times when Daniel had faced silent discrimination or even open hostility, like this morning. But what he admired most about Daniel was his ability to remain calm and professional in every situation. "You don't need to prove anything anymore," Eric said firmly. "You've been doing this for a long time, and no one can question your abilities, especially when I'm sitting right beside you." Daniel chuckled softly, feeling a bit of the tension ease thanks to Eric's encouragement. That's right, he had flown thousands of hours, handled countless emergencies, and always ensured the safety of his passengers. But the truth was, with every flight and every skeptical glance, it felt like he had to prove himself all over again. Outside, the plane began to taxi to the runway. The weather was gloomy, but not bad enough to prevent takeoff. Daniel focused on the task at hand, steering the plane toward the runway with complete professionalism and focus. In the passenger cabin, John looked around, noticing other passengers chatting casually or reading books. Yet he still felt an unusual sense of anxiety creeping up on him. His instincts as a cop made it hard for him to sit still when something made him uneasy. Although there was no concrete evidence to believe there was danger, John couldn't stop thinking that something could go wrong, especially with a pilot he believed wasn't experienced enough. Solely based on the color of his skin, the announcement chime rang out, signaling the plane's imminent takeoff. Passengers fastened their seatbelts, preparing for the long journey ahead. The engines began to roar louder as the plane accelerated down the runway. In the cockpit, Daniel gripped the controls firmly, his eyes focused, while Eric quickly checked the final parameters. The Boeing 737 lifted gently off the ground, rising above Los Angeles, which was shrouded in the faint morning mist. As the plane gained altitude, the engine noise became a familiar hum, easing the passengers into a sense of safety, though an invisible tension lingered in the cabin. Daniel Brooks sat in the cockpit, his eyes locked on the control panel. The familiar clicks of buttons and flashing signal lights were like the sky's whispers. Daniel had done this procedure thousands of times before, yet every takeoff still gave him a slight thrill. To him, lifting the plane off the ground was an art, a testament to perfect control and careful calculation. Eric Williams, his reliable colleague, sat next to him, glancing over Daniel's shoulder as the plane slowly stabilized. "The skies are still pretty smooth," Eric noted, his voice calm yet focused. "But the Midwest area doesn't look good. We might hit an unexpected storm." Daniel nodded, his eyes still on the radar screen. "The weather report shows we'll face some turbulence," he replied, his tone calm and professional. "But nothing too serious. We'll monitor it closely and adjust if needed." Eric smiled slightly, the confidence in his gaze always a source of reassurance for Daniel. They had worked together for years, and Eric had absolute faith in Daniel's abilities. "You've handled worse storms before," Eric said. Daniel smiled lightly, though the unease remained. Despite having dealt with numerous dangerous situations throughout his career, he couldn't help but think about the skeptical looks he had sensed from the passengers, especially John Caldwell. This tension wasn't just from the unfavorable weather, but from the prejudice he had faced all his life. Those glances, those whispers, those subtle racist remarks, they were always there, always a part of his world. Meanwhile, in first class, John Caldwell still couldn't shake his growing anxiety. The plane had leveled off at cruising altitude, but his heart remained heavy with worry. Unlike the other passengers who were starting to relax, reading books, watching movies, or closing their eyes, John couldn't find peace. He couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, the black pilot he had just met. The biases ingrained in John's mind wouldn't leave him alone. Is he really capable? Can someone like that really handle flying this plane safely? John tried to calm himself with logical reasoning. Daniel could have gone through thousands of hours of training and could be an excellent pilot, but John's inner prejudice wouldn't quiet down. He remembered his work, the years as a cop where he had faced many emergencies, where alertness was the difference between life and death. "I have to stay alert," he thought. "If anything goes wrong, I'll know right away." The flight attendants began passing through the rows, offering drinks and snacks. Some passengers politely accepted water and started sipping, while John declined with a slight shake of his head. He wasn't interested in drinks. The anxiety weighing on him was all he could think about. His police instincts kicked in. He had to stay in control of the situation. He glanced toward the cockpit door. Though there was nothing specific to indicate danger, John still felt uneasy. "I have to do something," John thought. He reached for the button to call the flight attendant, but then paused. "No, not yet," he told himself. "Everything's still normal. Maybe I'm just overthinking." John tried to recline in his seat and took a deep breath. "Maybe I'm just imagining things." But no matter how hard he tried, the image of Daniel in the cockpit wouldn't leave his mind. The fear that someone like Daniel might make a mistake and lead to a catastrophic result haunted John relentlessly. Meanwhile, up front in the cockpit, Daniel was completely focused on his job. He checked the indicators on the control panel once more, feeling every slight shake of the plane as they began to enter areas of varying air pressure. The radar still indicated that the storm in the Midwest was approaching, but everything was still under control. "We're going to drop altitude a bit as we get closer to the turbulence," Daniel told Eric, who was watching the radar beside him. "The storm seems to be moving faster than expected." Eric agreed, and the two continued discussing the necessary adjustments to ensure a safe flight. These conversations were full of professionalism and confidence, showing that both were well-versed in handling difficult situations in the air. But in the passenger cabin, John's anxiety continued to escalate. He couldn't stop himself from thinking that something was wrong. His hands clenched together in tension, and his eyes kept darting toward the cockpit as if he expected something to go wrong any second now. John sat tensely in the passenger cabin, his eyes fixed on the cockpit door as the worry in his heart grew. Though the plane was still flying smoothly, each slight shake caused by shifting air pressure only made him more restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then, just as predicted, signs of the storm began to appear. Inside the cockpit, Daniel and Eric noticed the first changes on the radar screen. The storm ahead started to form clearly, dense clouds showing up on the screen, signaling that the plane was about to encounter greater turbulence than anticipated. Daniel frowned slightly as he reviewed the flight path. There was still time to change altitude and adjust the course to avoid the most severe turbulence, but it wouldn't be easy. "The storm's coming faster than expected," Daniel said, his voice calm but sharp, his hands quickly adjusting the controls. "We'll have to drop altitude now to avoid the worst part." Eric glanced at the radar, noticing the storm moving toward them faster than initially forecasted. "I agree," he said, still checking the system's status. "Dropping altitude will help us dodge the worst, but there'll be a few seconds of rough turbulence." Daniel nodded and made the decision. He activated the cabin intercom, and his voice echoed through the quiet air of the passenger cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Daniel Brooks," Daniel said, his voice professional but steady. "We are about to experience some turbulence due to bad weather ahead. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain calm. We are adjusting our altitude to ensure a safe flight." John heard the announcement and immediately felt his anxiety rise. Words like turbulence and bad weather only heightened his unease. The fear that had been simmering just beneath the surface now surged forward more intensely than ever. He sat frozen, his eyes scanning the other passengers, but no one seemed as disturbed as he was. These people are too relaxed, John thought, but they don't understand things could get much worse. The plane began to descend slightly, and the mild shakes that started earlier became more pronounced. For most passengers, it was just a normal part of flying, but for John, each small shake felt like an alarm bell. He became hyper-aware of everything, and as the plane shook more violently, his fear turned into panic. In the cockpit, Daniel remained perfectly calm, his hands steady on the controls. The sudden jolts from the wind and storm clouds didn't faze him. Eric stood by, assisting with every action swiftly. They had handled many similar situations before, but Daniel knew that every flight brought its own challenges. In the back, John couldn't hold back his anxiety any longer. As the plane shook harder, he felt like everything was spiraling out of control. "I can't just sit here," he thought. "I need to do something." John's panic finally reached its peak. He hurriedly unfastened his seatbelt and stood up from his seat, despite the plane's shaking. A few passengers nearby began to watch him, surprised by his sudden movement. "You can't stand up right now," a flight attendant approached, her voice filled with concern. "Please sit down and fasten your seatbelt immediately." But John ignored the warning. "I need to speak to the pilot," he said, his voice rising in panic. "I don't trust that man. He doesn't know what he's doing." The entire passenger cabin fell silent at John's words. Curious eyes began to turn toward him. The flight attendant remained calm, still trying to stop him. "Please, sir, return to your seat. We assure you that everything is under control." But John, overwhelmed by prejudice and fear, wouldn't listen. He marched forward, his face set with determination. "I don't trust him," John said louder, causing more passengers to start whispering among themselves. John's words began to stir tension among the passengers. Some started to worry too, while others tried to assess the situation logically. But John had lost his composure. John Caldwell marched toward the cockpit door, his legs wobbling due to the plane's shaking. Despite warnings from the flight attendant and the concerned looks of the passengers, he couldn't stop. Fear and panic had overtaken his reasoning, pushing him to do something he never thought he would: confront the person he believed was putting them all in danger. The Boeing 737 was now flying into a storm bigger than expected. Dark clouds surrounded the sky outside, and the plane swayed continuously under the force of strong gusts. The sharp turbulence made the passengers nervous, some gripping their armrests tightly, while others groaned in fear. The cabin lights flickered, creating a tense and suffocating atmosphere. John couldn't hold back anymore. The deep-seated biases, combined with the storm's anxiety, exploded into fury. When he reached the cockpit door, he pounded on it, creating a loud bang that echoed through the tense silence of the first-class cabin. "Open the door!" John yelled, his voice filled with anger. "I don't trust you! Open it now!" Inside the cockpit, Daniel and Eric were focused on navigating the plane through severe turbulence. Strong gusts of wind battered the aircraft, causing it to shake violently. They had adjusted the altitude to avoid the most dangerous part of the storm, but it was still a tough situation. Daniel gripped the controls tightly, concentrating on keeping the plane steady, while Eric constantly monitored the instruments to ensure everything was functioning properly. The loud banging on the cockpit door startled both pilots. Eric lifted his headset to contact the chief flight attendant. "What's going on out there?" he asked quickly, his eyes still fixed on the radar screens. The chief flight attendant's voice came through the intercom, full of concern. "It's a passenger. He's causing trouble," she replied. "He's demanding to see the pilot, and we're trying to hold him back." Daniel frowned slightly, his hands steady on the control panel. He knew the tension on the plane was rising, not just because of the bad weather, but also because the passengers were panicking. But he didn't have time to deal with this issue right now. "Keep him in his seat," Daniel said over the intercom, his voice calm but firm. "I'll handle it once we stabilize the plane." John, however, was not easily deterred. The banging on the door and his angry voice continued. "You don't know what you're doing. You're going to kill us." John's shouting only added to the tension in the passenger cabin. Some passengers started to get nervous, glancing at each other with worried expressions. A few whispered to each other, fearing that the situation might be more dangerous than they had realized. In the cockpit, Eric looked at Daniel, his eyes filled with concern. "We have to do something," he said quietly, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. This could turn into a serious disturbance. Daniel remained calm. He had faced many tough situations throughout his career, but this was the first time he had to deal with a passenger like John, someone clearly overwhelmed by fear and prejudice. He knew he couldn't let this escalate, especially not in the middle of a storm. After a brief moment of thought, Daniel decided it was time to confront John. He couldn't allow this passenger to cause further panic among the others. Daniel set the plane to temporary autopilot, ensuring it was in a stable position, then stood up and motioned for Eric to keep an eye on the instruments. "I'll go talk to him," Daniel said, his voice still calm. "I'll handle this." Eric nodded, though his eyes were full of worry. "Be careful," he warned. "He's out of control." Daniel gave a slight nod and approached the cockpit door. When he opened it, his eyes met John's. An angry and panicked middle-aged man, his face red with frustration. John's eyes blazed with fury, and for a few seconds, the two men stood facing each other in a silence so heavy, it felt suffocating. "What do you want?" Daniel asked, his voice low but steady. He showed no signs of weakness, despite the obvious tension in the air. His gaze locked onto John's, unwavering. John, still consumed by fear, pointed an accusatory finger at Daniel. "You're not capable of flying this plane," he shouted. "You're going to kill us all. I don't trust you." John's accusations echoed through the cabin, causing everyone to stop and watch. The passengers nearby stared at the tense scene unfolding before them, too afraid to speak. Daniel stood his ground, his eyes never blinking in the face of John's baseless accusations. These kinds of words were not new to him. Throughout his life and career, Daniel had faced irrational judgments because of the color of his skin. But this situation, on a dangerous flight, carried an entirely different weight. "You need to understand," Daniel said, his voice slow but commanding. "My colleague and I are doing everything we can to get everyone home safely, including you. If you can't stay calm, then sit down and let us do our job." But John, his mind clouded by prejudice and fear, couldn't process the explanation. In his rage, he swung his arm and suddenly slapped Daniel across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the tense atmosphere, shocking everyone nearby. A few passengers gasped in disbelief, and the entire cabin fell into absolute silence. Daniel felt the sting on his cheek, but he didn't flinch or react violently. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on John, and the calmness in his gaze only made the situation clearer. In that moment, everyone could see the complete control Daniel had, not just over the plane, but also in the way he handled the irrational anger and racism from John. Eric quickly moved toward the cockpit door, ready to intervene after seeing the slap. But before he could do anything, Daniel raised his hand, signaling him to stop. Daniel didn't show any anger. He took a deep breath, pushing down the pain and humiliation, and looked straight at John. "You need to go back to your seat right now," Daniel said, his voice firm and resolute. "We are responsible for the safety of over 200 people on this flight. If you can't stay calm, you're putting everyone's lives in danger. I'm asking you to sit down." John stood still for a few seconds. His anger, which had flared up just moments ago, began to fade as he looked into Daniel's calm and professional eyes. For the first time during the flight, John started to feel regret creeping into his heart. He stood frozen in front of Daniel, realizing the strength and professionalism of the pilot he had doubted all along. The slap, an impulsive act driven by panic and prejudice, now felt like something he couldn't justify, rooted in fears that had been ingrained in him for years. John looked into Daniel's eyes and saw no revenge or anger there. Instead, he saw an incredible calm, the kind of calm one expects from a true professional in a tough situation. All the prejudices John had carried for years seemed to be challenged in that moment, as he faced a man he had so wrongly judged. "Sit down, John," Daniel repeated, his voice low but firm. We'll get everyone to safety. That's my responsibility. And I know what I'm doing. John slowly lowered his trembling arm. In that moment, his actions became clearer than ever. He hadn't just been wrong about Daniel's abilities. He realized that his fear wasn't about the storm or the flight at all. It was about the deep-rooted prejudice that had clouded his judgment for so long. Now, in the middle of the storm, with hundreds of lives depending on Daniel, John had to face that truth. He stood in silence, ashamed. Outside, the wind continued to howl against the plane, and the violent shaking persisted. But all those sounds seemed to fade from John's mind. There was only the silence between him and Daniel, and the deep sense of regret rising in his chest. You need to sit down, Daniel said again, but this time his voice was gentler, as if he understood that John had already realized his mistake. We'll get everyone to safety. That's my job, and I will do it. John nodded slightly, his eyes briefly wandering as he turned back toward his seat. The other passengers still watched him, but no one said a word. Some looked tense, while others seemed relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further. John returned to his seat, feeling as if all the strength had drained from his body. He sat down, fastened his seatbelt, but his hands were still shaking. Inside, the shame and regret overwhelmed him. I was wrong, he thought. Wrong about everything. In the cockpit, Daniel returned to his seat, gripping the controls as the plane continued to push through the storm. Eric looked at him, his eyes full of respect. You handled that well, Eric said, breaking the silence. Daniel only nodded, saying nothing more. He focused on his task, keeping the plane steady in the powerful winds. But inside, he also felt that something had changed. This wasn't the first time Daniel had faced prejudice, but rarely had it played out so openly, in front of hundreds of passengers. What mattered most was how he handled it, not allowing anger or personal frustration to control his actions. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere gradually began to calm as the plane flew out of the turbulence. Though the passengers were still anxious, a sense of stability returned. The violent shaking had subsided, leaving only the sound of the wind outside and the hum of the engines. A few people sighed with relief, and no one wanted to remember the tense moment that had just passed. John sat quietly, his eyes staring into the space in front of him. He couldn't focus on anything else but what had just happened. His years as a police officer had taught him the importance of good judgment, but today he realized that he had let prejudice cloud his mind, leading him to wrongfully judge a man who didn't deserve it. The flight continued, but for John, this was a journey he would never forget. Not because of the storm, but because of the profound lesson he had just learned. A lesson about courage, professionalism, and the ability to reflect on oneself. Daniel and Eric continued to steer the plane through the rest of the storm with the highest level of precision and skill. Although the weather remained challenging, they knew they had made it through the most dangerous part. The cabin lights flickered once more, then stabilized, signaling that the storm was now behind them. A little later, Daniel turned on the intercom, his voice echoing through the cabin, this time without the earlier tension. Ladies and gentlemen, we have successfully passed through the bad weather and will continue our journey to New York. Please be assured we will arrive safely. Thank you for your patience. Daniel's voice sounded like a promise. The passengers relaxed, and a few even smiled at the announcement. The entire cabin seemed to release the tension it had been holding on to, and many resumed their relaxed activities during the flight. John listened quietly to the announcement, saying nothing, but he couldn't deny the change that had taken place in him. John sat quietly, gripping the armrests as if trying to find some safety amidst his chaotic thoughts. Daniel's voice still echoed in his mind, not just as a promise to bring everyone to safety, but also as a reminder of the professionalism of the pilot he had wrongfully judged. As the plane continued its journey, leaving the bad weather behind, John's inner storm still raged. He knew he had been wrong, completely wrong. His prejudice had blinded him, clouding his judgment, and in that panicked moment, it had driven him to an act he couldn't even justify to himself. The slap to Daniel's face wasn't just a personal insult, it was a denial of everything Daniel had earned through his skill and ability. John felt he had to do something. He couldn't let things end like this, couldn't let the guilt hang over him for the rest of the flight, and perhaps for much longer. He leaned back in his seat, took a deep breath, and slowly stood up. Other passengers watched him, their eyes still holding some surprise from earlier. But this time, John didn't seem out of control anymore. He walked toward the cockpit door, but there was no anger or fear in his eyes now. John stood before the cockpit door and knocked lightly, this time much more gently. After a moment, the door opened and Eric appeared, his eyes cautious but not as tense as before. "What do you need?" Eric asked, his tone no longer harsh but still wary. John stood still for a moment, then spoke with a quiet and sincere voice. I want to speak to Daniel. I need to apologize to him." Eric studied John, and his eyes softened a little as he recognized the sincerity in John's words. He nodded slightly and turned back to look at Daniel, who was seated at the controls but could clearly hear what John had said. Daniel turned his head, his eyes meeting John's, and for a few seconds, the two men silently looked at each other. John felt the weight of the tension he had created, not just between him and Daniel, but throughout the entire flight. But now, as he stood before Daniel in a calmer moment, he knew what he had to do to make things right. With all the sincerity he could muster, John began to speak. "Daniel," he started, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of his shame. "I was wrong, completely wrong. I shouldn't have doubted you, and I acted out of line. My prejudice and fear got the best of me. I'm really sorry for what happened." Daniel remained silent for a few moments, his sharp eyes showing no sign of anger. He had experienced many instances of being judged solely based on his appearance and skin color, but what mattered to Daniel more than anything now was the sincerity in John's apology. He saw the regret in John's eyes, and he knew that holding on to anger wouldn't help in situations like this. After a long pause, Daniel nodded slightly. "I understand," he said, his voice calm and composed. "No one is perfect, and everyone has moments when emotions take over. What's important is that you recognize that. But now, we need to focus on getting everyone to safety. That's my top responsibility." John breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing those words. He hadn't expected Daniel to forgive him so easily. But Daniel wasn't someone who held on to grudges or anger, and John realized how lucky he was to be dealing with someone like that. "You're a great pilot," John added, his voice softer now. "I've seen that. Thank you for keeping us safe." Daniel only smiled slightly, then turned back to the control panel, focusing on the task at hand. He didn't say anything more, but his eyes showed that everything was resolved. John stepped back, feeling a sense of relief unlike any he had felt before. He returned to his seat, this time without any worry, without any doubt or fear. He knew that he had learned something important, not just about the black pilot flying the plane, but about himself and the unconscious biases that had shaped his life for so many years. The passengers in the cabin began to return to normal. Some resumed reading their books or watching movies. The occasional small jolts continued, but no one was afraid anymore. The plane had passed through the worst of the storm, and now, under Daniel's steady control, it was heading straight toward New York, with the soft light of dawn breaking on the horizon. John sat back in his seat, feeling truly at peace for the first time during the flight, as he looked out the window and saw the clear sky ahead. The plane continued toward New York, the gentle morning light beginning to shine through the windows, pushing away the dark clouds of the storm they had left behind. Everything now felt lighter, not just for the plane, but for John's mind as well. The intercom buzzed once again, and this time it was Eric who spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing to land at JFK International Airport in New York. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain calm. Thank you for flying with us, and have a wonderful day." The announcement rang out like a confirmation that the tense journey was nearing its end. John took a deep breath, listening to the familiar sounds of the plane as it began its descent. There was no more anxiety or tension this time, only a sense of peace and relief. He knew that, through this flight, he had learned much more than just surviving a storm. He had overcome a barrier he hadn't even realized was there. The Boeing 737 touched down smoothly on the runway at JFK. In the passenger cabin, people began to gather their belongings, their whispered conversations rising around them. But no one mentioned the tense event from earlier. Daniel had completed his mission flawlessly, bringing everyone to safety, and the passengers' initial worries had dissipated along with the gray clouds. As the plane came to a complete stop, the cabin door opened, and passengers began to disembark, all looking relieved after the long journey. John stood up from his seat, grabbed his bag, and walked toward the door. Though he still felt a tinge of awkwardness, he knew he had one more thing to do, one last time. As he reached the cockpit door, Daniel and Eric were standing, as usual, saying goodbye to the passengers. John stopped, his eyes meeting Daniel's. There was no need for many words. Just a nod from Daniel was enough to show that everything was behind them, and forgiveness had already been granted. John, feeling a huge weight lift from his shoulders, smiled slightly and extended his hand to Daniel. "Thank you, Daniel. You're an excellent pilot, and I owe you a sincere thank you," John said, his voice low and heartfelt. Daniel shook John's hand, a firm handshake with no hint of hostility. "I was just doing my job," Daniel replied, smiling softly. "Thank you for understanding." John quietly left the plane, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He knew that this encounter had changed the way he looked at people and life. This flight wasn't just a journey from Los Angeles to New York. It was a journey from fear and prejudice to understanding and empathy. Back inside the plane, Daniel and Eric continued to say goodbye to the last of the passengers. When everyone had disembarked, Eric turned to Daniel, a smile spreading across his face. "You handled that really well, Daniel," Eric said, his voice full of respect. "Not everyone could manage a situation like that with such calm." Daniel just smiled lightly, shrugging. "That's my job, but I think we helped them through more than just a storm in the air today." Eric nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we weathered some storms inside people too." The two of them stepped out of the cockpit, preparing for their next flight. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, signaling a new day full of hope and opportunity. For Daniel, as well as for John, this was the beginning of a future free from the old chains of prejudice, replaced by respect, understanding, and equality. This story is not just about getting through a storm, but also about overcoming prejudice and fear. John learned to respect Daniel, who proved that skill doesn't depend on skin color, but on courage and professionalism. This is a lesson about tolerance, understanding, and mutual respect. If this story has inspired you, subscribe to the channel to follow more meaningful stories about human strength and growth. Thank you for watching.